My name is Alex, and I was driving through the night from Indianapolis to Cincinnati to sit with my uncle after his surgery. It was late, the interstate felt like a ribbon of black glass, and I was tired in a way that made my hands tremble at the steering wheel. I pulled off at the smallest exit for a hospital that showed up on my phone like a pale promise of fluorescent light, because the highway ahead was empty and the gas gauge leaned toward empty. I did not plan to stay long. I did not expect what followed. The hospital parking lot smelled of cold rain and diesel. The sodium lights hummed in an even, low way. I remember the sound of my boots on wet pavement and the metallic taste of anxiety at the back of my tongue. Inside the emergency department, the air smelled like antiseptic and coffee gone bitter, and the fluorescent panels made everything a tired, flat color. At the front desk, a placard said, "Visitors after midnight must sign in," which made me fumble for my phone. A night clerk with a name tag that read Linda looked up like she had been carved from the same tired light. I told her who I was there to see and why I had come. She nodded and slid a visitor sticker across the counter. Her hands smelled faintly of hand lotion and cigarette smoke. The corridor beyond the desk curved into yawning quiet and the slow beeping of distant monitors. I could hear the muffled echo of footsteps and an intercom chime, and then I heard something else, a small sound that did not belong to that sterile rhythm, a mattress squeak, like someone shifting in the dark in a bed that nobody claimed. When I pushed open the door to my uncle's room, the clock on the wall blinked 1:17 a.m. The bed was against the far wall, and a single monitor blinked in soft blue. The room smelled of lemon disinfectant, faded bed linen, and the antiseptic tang that always follows surgical wards. My uncle was awake, but drowsy and smiling, as if he had been given a small private joke. I sat, we talked for a few minutes about banal things, and then I stood to get a coffee from the hall. The hallway light pooled on the floor like a river, and the night shift nurses moved with small, economical gestures. As I walked past the open doors, I glanced into a bed across the hall and saw a pale sheet rising and falling. A middle-aged man lay there, and then there was a shift in the air, as if a page had turned. Then the mattress was empty. The bed made a sound like a deep inhalation, and the sheet trembled where no feet remained. My blood went cold. I called over my shoulder to Nurse Karen, who was recharting at a nurse station. My first instinct was to speak to staff. I am not the sort of person who believes in ghost stories at 3 in the morning, but that moment in that hallway felt wrong in a very clear, physical way. I had come to sit with a family member and ended up watching a bed that seemed to breathe without a body. I asked out loud who had been in that bed, and the nurse named a patient, a Mr. Tom Harris, in room 312. Nurse Karen said he was asleep and that there had been no movement besides normal vitals. The monitor trace slid in a familiar, steady line of beeps. I remembered the smell of the nurse's coffee and the clack of a keyboard when she typed his name. I remember the way the fluorescent light made everything feel thin. That is how the story started, and how I ended up following a small thread that pulled me into 6 different hospital nights, each with a stranger's face and each with a detail that refused to fit. The building felt unusually porous. Doors opened with a hollow sigh, the automatic sensors whispered. Voices were softer at night, and corridors kept their secrets in the hum of heating and cooling and the tread of shoes. I filed my first report in the emergency intake log in pencil and crossed my name as a visitor. I spoke to Linda again. The exchange that followed was one I replayed in my head for days because it never resolved. Linda: "You okay, hon?" Asked about the man I had seen. Me: "He was in 312 a minute ago. I swear I saw him there." Linda: "Room 312 is empty tonight. We moved him earlier to a different floor." Me: "Why would you move him without telling family?" Linda: "We called the number on file. Nobody answered." Me: "Who moved him?" Linda: "A transport team. Come on, it is late. You need to sit down." Me: "Which team?" "It is paperwork, not a mystery." Me: "I took the hallway camera feed and watched it back on the nurse's station screen." Linda paused and said nothing. Her eyes were tired and small. The conversation ran like a thread you pulled and could not quite knot. That first refusal to acknowledge what I had seen was the small stone that began an avalanche. There were 5 people who became anchors in this story. Nurse Karen was the steady one who tried to tamp down my insistence. Dr. Patel was the attending physician with the soft voice that did not match the decisive way he moved through patient charts. Officer Ramirez was the patrol officer from the county who initially took my informal complaint and whose reports became a paper trail. Janitor Mike cleaned floors and watched with an expression that was sometimes indulgent and sometimes fearful. Receptionist Linda managed late-night flux and folded my questions into the list of things she had to keep moving. Each of them later supplied a detail that would not have existed on its own. I also spoke with a visitor named Sarah, who had a fair amount to tell, and with a patient called Tom, who once occupied a bed and later disappeared from his bed on a night when the lights in the hallway blinked wrong. The second block of that night became the installation of place and people. The emergency room smelled of hand sanitizer and old coffee. The reception desk hummed with fluorescent light. I signed in and waited for a visitor sticker and watched the clock as the numbers advanced. The man behind the counter was called Paul, and he spoke while balancing a phone on his shoulder and clicking a mouse. My interaction with him became a longer piece of dialogue than I expected. Me: "Hi, I am here to see James Miller." Paul: "Name and relation?" I gave my name and he typed for a second. Paul: "Visiting hours are technically over." Me: "He just had surgery. I drove 2 hours." Paul: "You need to sign in and only one visitor at a time." Me: "I know, I just need a minute." Paul: "ID and you must leave by 3. Me: "I do not plan to stay that long, but my car is low on gas." Paul: "That is not my problem. Can you tell me where room 312 is?" Paul: "3rd floor, down the corridor, past the elevators." "Is the ward quiet tonight?" "Quiet is good in here." "Did you know a Tom Harris was in 312 earlier?" "We have a lot of patients." "He was in the bed across from my uncle." "I will see what I can find." "Thank you." Paul: "You are welcome. Have a seat." The exchange stretched the desk and its small bureaucracy into an axis around which my later questions spun. The physical details are important because they anchor the odd in the ordinary. The elevator had that soft metallic sigh and smelled of disinfectant and wet rubber. The carpet in the hallway was thick and compressed near the beds. The sound of suction machines from an adjacent room underscored the emptiness. At the nurses' station, a bulletin board was populated with laminated memos and a printed sheet of staff rotation schedules. A miniature clock on the wall glowed with green digits. The curtains around each bed had a texture like washed polyester and moved with the draft from the HVAC in a patient, rhythmic fashion. The lighting had zones of warmth and cold that left faces oddly shadowed. These sensory fragments are the scaffolding for a story that insists on being precise about what felt wrong. The first incident that made me sure something was wrong happened at 1:42 a.m. I had stepped into the hallway to smoke a cigarette under the canopy because I could not sleep and because the night had a hungover clarity. When I came back, the door to room 312 was ajar. The monitor for that bed was still powering and showing vitals. The bedsheet was undisturbed except for a small fold where the feet should have been. I knocked, then pushed the curtain aside, and then the scene became an immediate coldness in my bones. The linens were cool to the touch, and the pulse shown on the monitor was stable, but there was no patient. I looked under the bed and around the chair. Chair was folded and empty. The window that looked over the parking lot was closed and the blinds were pulled down. For a few seconds, logic scrambled and the hallway seemed longer than it should be. I called out to Nurse Karen, who was charting, and she came immediately, talking in a rush and then slowing down. What followed was a long, detailed back-and-forth conversation that did not fit a short summary.
"Nurse Karen, I left him here. I was charting his meds."
"He is gone."
"He was compressing a wound earlier."
"The bed is empty."
"Are you sure you are not mixing him up with another patient?"
"He was here a minute ago. I watched his chest rise."
"Maybe you are tired."
"My uncle is down the corridor. I saw him."
"Did anyone take him for a test?"
"No one asked me."
We transport patients all night sometimes for scans and transfers.
There is no movement on the transport logs for 1:30 to 1:45 a.m.
I will check the CCTV and the transport log.
Please, I need to know where he went.
I will have to open a report.
Some lines opened, some closed. The nurse moved with the kind of measured ambiguity that hospitals develop to maintain function. She believed procedural answers could replace the cold sense I had, but the CCTV footage did not show a stretcher or staff moving a patient out of that room at the time I had seen him. The transport log had a gap while the monitor recorded flat, continuous vitals and a bed that seemed to breathe. I took photos, made notes, and filed what I presumed was an observational report. When the hospital could not reconcile the physical absence of a man who minutes earlier had been breathing in his bed, I began to ask questions online. I posted in a regional subreddit for the city using a throwaway account and titled the post, "I saw a patient vanish from his bed in the middle of the night at Mercy General." I uploaded 2 photos from my phone, the ones with the monitor visible and the sheet folded where feet should be. The post started a thread. A woman named Sarah replied that her brother had been moved without family notification 3 months earlier from that very hospital, and that she had never received an explanation. A user named Nightcoder linked to an old local news item about a patient who had wandered off and later been found disoriented in a gas station bathroom. Another user shared a screenshot from a TripAdvisor-style forum where reviewers had complained about inconsistent shift handoffs and a pattern of missing paperwork. Slowly, the thread filled with scattered accounts. Some were mundane, some were alarming, and some had a smell of the extraordinary because they included small but uncanny parallels. A blank transport log, a receptionist who could not find a record, a piece of cloth with a smear of dried blood found in a trash slot. I spent the next day piecing together a pattern because the staff interviews had been minimal and the official paper trail seemed porous. I called the number on file from Mr. Tom Harris and left a message. I emailed the hospital administration and flagged the incident for a formal record. I also reached out to Officer Ramirez, who came on the shift that night to take my report. Officer Ramirez wrote down what I said with a professional politeness and told me there are times hospitals transfer patients quietly for safety concerns or to protect privacy, and that dispatch logs always showed movement. Ramirez: "Do you have ID for the patient?" Me: "No, I only know him by the name on the whiteboard." Ramirez: "Okay, we will look at admission records. Will you check CCTV? I will request it through official channels. How long will that take?" "A few days at least." The official channels moved slowly. That slowness is part of the environment. It is part of what allows small omissions to become patterns. My backstory matters because it shaped what I noticed and what I did next. I was raised by a mother who worked night shifts and learned to read the cues in quiet places. She was a practical woman who kept lists and files. From her, I took an impatience with bureaucracy and a belief that small, repeated sloppy things often point to larger problems. I was also a journalist for a regional paper for several years, which taught me how to document and follow threads through public records and to triangulate memory with evidence. When someone told me not to worry because hospitals move people all the time, I heard a reflex that clustered with other small refusals I had seen in other institutions. I had seen official non-answers become reasons to stop asking. That was not an abstract belief. It was a lived suspicion born of nights in waiting rooms and paper trails that had holes. My father's illness taught me patience measured by a clock between treatments and gave me a sense for how small things become emergencies when no one notices the arithmetic of omission. Waiting rooms taught me to listen to voices in low pitch because people tell more when they are tired. The combination of those experiences made me a careful observer. I carried a small notebook and a cheap voice recorder in my pocket from habit. That night I used both. I wrote down times as I checked the monitor screen, and I recorded conversations with staff and with a few visitors who were willing to speak. Those recordings later became a spine for the narrative I could not otherwise cite. Without that background, I might have been a passing note in someone else's chart. With it, I became a person with a file and a voice. The online investigation produced small but concrete threads. A local newspaper article from nearly 2 years earlier documented a case where the hospital had suffered a staffing shortage that winter and had allowed outpatient transports to be handled by contract companies. There were posts on a hospital review site complaining about delayed discharges and misstated charts. A Reddit user uploaded an audio clip which sounded like distant yelling and a mechanical voice announcing patient move codes at 2:03 a.m. Someone named Janitor Mike, who cleans at night, posted anonymously to a neighborhood forum complaining about how often doors were left unlocked and gowns misplaced. And then he messaged me directly to say he had once found a bed unoccupied with a sheet that still had the smell of body and no evidence of transfer. That anonymous tip later became confirmatory when Mike agreed to speak on record with Officer Ramirez. I also found a state health department inspection report that noted missing signatures on the transport log from a rotational period 6 months earlier. Taken individually, these items were not damning. Together, they formed a lattice. The technical description of my processing of these documents is important for credibility. I requested CCTV footage through the hospital's patient relations office and filed a formal public records request for incident logs and transport manifests. I compared timestamps on monitor logs against the transport manifests to identify discrepancies. I used forensic timestamps embedded in photo metadata to match my phone images with system logs. Those steps produced a timeline I could share with Officer Ramirez and with hospital administration. The timeline revealed a 12-minute window where monitor data aligned with movement in the hallway recorded by a security camera, but where the transport manifest had no corresponding entry. That kind of procedural mismatch is small but meaningful when you are trying to prove an absence. As I continued to press, the hospital response shifted from polite minimalism to careful defensiveness. Dr. Patel requested a sit-down to hear my account and to explain hospital policy. He spoke in a calm, almost textbook cadence and poured a cup of coffee that smelled of cream and scorched beans. Dr. Patel: "We are sorry for your concern, Alex." Me: "He was in the bed across from my uncle." Dr. Patel: "Patients sometimes get up to go to the bathroom and forget to tell staff." Me: "The bed monitor still registered vitals, and then there was no one there." Dr. Patel: "We will pull the footage. There was no recorded transport." Dr. Patel: "I cannot comment on ongoing internal reviews. Are there missing entries in the log? Our system is complex, and sometimes entries are delayed. Who has access to late-night transfers? Security and transport teams primarily. Who were they that night? I cannot give you staff names in an open area. Are families notified of transfers? We attempt to contact next of kin. My uncle did not know Mr. Harris had left. Communication is not perfect. What happens if a patient goes missing?" Dr. Patel paused. He sipped coffee. Dr. Patel: "We have protocols. We will conduct an internal review." That word review felt like a hinge that would either open or close. The hospital said they would review the footage and check the transport manifests. They asked for time and space. They appointed a risk manager named Angela, who promised to update me in 48 hours. That 48-hour window produced the first escalation. 3 nights after the disappearance, another patient reported the same sensation of presence and absence. A woman in a room 2 doors down told her visiting sister that a man had sat in a chair at the foot of her bed and stared at the wall, and then had walked out into the corridor and evaporated. The 2 of them called the nurse, who came with a small cart and a phone and wrote things down slowly. The pattern was small, repeated details that did not amount to a coherent crime, but that had the same flavor of omission and abrupt absence. The hospital began to feel like a place where the outlines of reality could be smudged at night. The nights that followed included 3 intense moments of tension that I cannot abbreviate without losing their force. The first moment happened when I stayed overnight to keep watch. I had a small cot in the family room and a thermos of coffee. Around 2:12 a.m., I heard a pattern of knocking at my uncle's door that I recognized from a childhood memory of code tapping. It was a rhythm of 3 short knocks, followed by a long one, and then 2 short. My heart locked into the cadence. I rose, put on shoes, and opened the door. The hallway light glowed, and the night nurse was nowhere in sight. The curtain across from my uncle's bed trembled, though there was no one behind it. The knocking pattern began again from inside the curtain. I grabbed a clipboard and shouted, "Me!" in a voice that braided anger and fear. The response was the scrape of a cartwheel and a noise like breathing through fabric. I yanked the curtain and found nothing. I recall the smell of heat and the metallic tang of adrenaline. I sat on the floor against the bed and tried to steady my breathing. That moment stretched into a memory that braided some childhood fear with the present and made me operate on instinct rather than logic. The second moment of tension was a confrontation with a stranger in the hallway. I saw a silhouette moving with deliberate steps and followed. Me, "Hey, who are you?" The silhouette did not answer and kept walking toward the service exit. I reached the fire door and found it locked, but someone had left a shoe outside and a blanket partially on the threshold. I felt a presence watching. I called out to janitor Mike, who was sweeping 2 floors down. "Mike, you should not be wandering alone at this hour." Me, "That man, he was there, and now the door is shut." Mike, "People sleep in corners sometimes." Me, "There is a pattern." Mike, "There are patterns in every place." Me, "I feel like someone is copying movement and then vanishing." Mike, "Maybe they are sick." Me, "But the monitors show vitals." Mike, "I clean what is left." The exchange was full of short syllables and the smell of floor cleaner. The presence of a human object left on a threshold like a dropped clue made my skin feel like it had too few neurons between stimulus and reaction. The third moment of tension was when a security guard, Officer Ramirez, returned with a copy of CCTV after the hospital complied and released footage to law enforcement. We sat in a small conference room with coffee gone cold. On the monitor, the footage played. There was a stretch of hallway where, at 1:31 a.m., a figure appeared and stood at the foot of bed 312, and then leaned in as if to speak to someone. The figure was not in a uniform we could clearly identify. The camera angle shifted and there was a flicker like static. When the footage returned, the bed was empty and the feet of a blanket fluttered as if caught on a breath. The hair on my forearm stood up when the monitor jumped frames and a white shape threaded into the doorway and out into a service elevator. Ramirez, "That is weird." Me, "Who is that?" Ramirez, "It looks like the janitor's jacket, but the jacket is unpaired. Could someone have taken him by ambulance? There is no record of mass transfer." The conference room smelled like stale coffee and carpet. The footage did not answer the question of how a man could leave a bed while monitor logs suggested continuity, and yet the manifest showed nothing. That skew created a sense of uncanny absence that made all of us in the room quieter. As the pattern developed, it felt less like a single missing person and more like an institutional thinness that allowed bodies to slip through. The hospital offered a partial explanation after a week. The internal review said there were clerical errors in the transport manifest and that a patient had been moved for psychiatric observation to a locked unit with a documented transfer. According to the review, the patient had been transported by a contracted team and the logs were misaligned by a staff member's late entry. The hospital placed a notation that they would strengthen handoff procedures and add camera angles to core corridors. That explanation answered a procedural gap, but it did not reconcile the footage showing a figure in non-standard clothing or the witness statements that said no one had seen the patient leave on a stretcher. I asked Officer Ramirez to file a missing persons investigation because the family had not been contacted and because the official paper trail had holes. Ramirez agreed to open a case. The police involvement brought a different tone. Officer Ramirez and Detective Lewis visited the hospital to interview staff and to collect logs. Detective Lewis was exacting and methodical. We sat in the records room while he looked through the manifest prints. Detective Lewis: "There is an 8-minute gap when transfers are recorded offline." Me: "Is that common?" Detective Lewis: "It happens during shift change or when the system updates." Me: "Who was on duty?" Detective Lewis: "A nurse named Karen and a transport lead named Marcus." "Who was Marcus?" Detective Lewis: A local contractor we have a file on for missing paperwork. Have you interviewed him? He has an alibi, but we are verifying. It was necessary to have a formal investigation because when something systemic is allowed to be sloppy, it invites further error. The police took formal statements and requested the hospital preserve and hand over all potential evidence. They also interviewed Mr. Harris's family, who were shocked to learn he had been moved. Sarah, who had earlier posted in the forum, came forward and told them more details about a previous unexplained transfer 2 years earlier. All of these added to the official file. During a second visit to the hospital, I rechecked the monitor logs and the playback again. I listened to the medical telemetry tech describe how timestamps are sometimes off when monitors are swapped without logging properly, and how a monitor can retain memory of vitals while the patient has been moved. That technical explanation in a way explained part of the mismatch, but not all of it. The image on the footage had an artifact at the moment of disappearance, and the artifact coincided with an entry in the transport log that had been written in after the fact. The artifact was a flicker of light and a brief blurring as if the camera had been occluded. No human explanation felt entirely clean. The hospital's risk manager, Angela, contacted me and promised a follow-up meeting and then delayed it while she collected findings. I continued to gather witnesses. A visitor named Sarah gave a longer statement describing a man in a brown jacket who had sat by the vending machine at 2 a.m. and who had been very pale and who had not spoken. Sarah, he just looked through people like they were glass. Did he get onto an elevator? He leaned into an elevator as if he wanted to be invisible. What did he look like? Like he needed help but did not ask for it. The threads multiplied. Janitor Mike agreed to look at the storage closet logs and found that a transport blanket had been signed out and then returned with a smear of something dark that was later noted as old blood. He photographed the blanket on his phone and sent the image to Officer Ramirez. The images matched a mark on a patient chart that had been circled as a healing laceration. These small crosslinks were what investigators rely on to move from anecdotes to reason. There were procedural descriptions I recorded because they show how lax processes allow gaps. The hospital had an internal policy for patient transfer that required a digital sign-off at both sending and receiving units. When monitors were swapped, a manual note was supposed to be entered. In practice, there were times when staff used sticky notes because the digital system was slow. Sticky notes fall off. The policy also required family notification in non-emergent transfers, but allowed clinicians to authorize immediate moves for safety. Those discretionary moments create an institutional gray area. That gray area is where confusion breeds. I pressed the hospital for CCTV and the health department for a review of transport logs. Officer Ramirez leaned on a county forensics unit to properly extract video and to check for tampering. The forensics team described frame rate inconsistencies that were likely due to a camera swap, but also mentioned that in low bandwidth conditions, a single frame can be missing and then recreated by interpolation. Those technical details sounded like obfuscation when I felt something more human at play, but they were real and they mattered. The escalation culminated in a confrontation one night with staff when I returned to the hospital with a small group from the online thread who wanted answers. We were a mix of family members and strangers who had experienced small anomalies. The hospital asked us to speak to patient relations, and a mediator named Angela convened a meeting. The dialogue that evening was long and full and carried the weight of people who had been pushed from uncertainty to seeking remedy. Me. You said you would give us footage? Angela. We are reviewing policies. Me. We waited 3 nights. Angela. We have to preserve privacy. Me. The family of Mr. Harris was not notified. Angela. We tried the number on file. Me. The point is, no one told the family. Angela. We will make it right. How long will it take? Angela. We cannot promise. Timetable. We went round and round with a mixture of empathy and official caution, and in the end, Angela promised an external audit and a meeting with the hospital board. That promise came with disclaimers. It was real as an institutional answer, but not as immediate as the fear we had felt. The police file developed. Detective Lewis took statements, pulled digital logs, and subpoenaed CCTV footage. The forensics explained the technical steps in writing for the record and described how they extracted the footage and calculated the timestamps to align the monitor logs with the visible corridor activity. That technical write-up ran about 300 words and used terms like frame rate, interpolation, metadata, and timecode. It lent credibility to the effort. They found that, while there were no signs of deliberate tampering, the footage had been recorded with room for human error and camera repositioning. The forensics report left open the possibility of human error in logging. Weeks passed and the public attention increased slightly because I published an edited compilation of footage and redacted photos and posted a detailed timeline in the regional subreddit and on a small local news site. The story gathered comments from past patients and families who described missing medications or unattended vital alarms. Some comments were hysterical, some were mundane, but a few gave names and times that matched our records. A small group of patient advocates reached out and asked to review hospital policies. The hospital announced policy changes and scheduled training on handoff procedures. 1 month after the first disappearance, the hospital issued a statement that a patient had been transferred for psychiatric observation under an involuntary order, and that family had been notified by phone. The statement read carefully and used the language of privacy and patient safety. On the 14th day, the hospital released a redacted timeline to the family and to the public. The family disputed some of the hospital's claims. They said that the number on file had not been answered and that their relationship with the patient would have required the hospital to attempt a visit in person before moving him. The hospital amended its statement and apologized for communication failures. In private, the family continued to tell a different version of events. They said that when they went to the unit, they found a bed made as if it had never been used and the belongings of a man who would later be located at a different facility 3 towns over with partial amnesia. The medical records showed a transfer and later an intake at a psychiatric unit. He had no recollection of the move. 1 month after the incident, the family was relieved to find him alive but anxious and disoriented. They reported inconsistencies in how the move had been executed and called for a full audit. 3 months later, regulatory review had produced recommendations for the hospital to change software settings and to implement double verification for transfers during tele. Off hours. The health department published a report that noted systemic vulnerabilities and recommended process changes for the entire county. The hospital complied with a training program and installed additional cameras in core corridors. The county board convened a hearing and staff testified about workload and understaffing during night shifts. The board accepted a plan for hiring additional night staff and for revising transfer protocols. The family of Mr. Harris testified and said they had mixed feelings about the outcome. They said they were glad he was found, but that the lack of transparency had cost them trust. They also told the story of a small leather wallet that had been returned with unfamiliar receipts and a business card from a clinic that did not belong to their relative. That small detail suggested a period where he had been elsewhere without recollection. 3 months on, the public record had hardened into institutional change, yet personal confusion remained. 6 months later, the landscape had shifted again. The hospital had completed an external audit that recommended clear steps and verified the implementation of a new digital sign-off system that required 2 staff signatures. There was a documented reduction in missing paperwork, and a compliance audit showed improvements. The family of Mr. Harris had hired a lawyer and negotiated a settlement for pain and suffering and for lack of communication. They continued to work with a social worker to help him cope with the episodes of disorientation. The hospital ran a small campaign about patient safety and made an internal vow to be transparent with families. On the other hand, the Reddit thread remained alive with occasional late-night posts from people who described similar moments of uncanny absence. The community formed a small group that met monthly to share experiences and to help advocate for patients' rights in smaller hospitals. They created a leaflet titled "What to Do If You Can't Find a Loved One in a Hospital" and distributed it at emergency rooms in the county. The result was not a tidy closure. The missing piece was not a criminal conspiracy, but a combination of human error, understaffing, procedural gaps, and, in one case, a psychiatric transfer that had not been effectively communicated. The frames of footage that had looked eerie were explained in part by camera artifacts and by the complexities of low-bandwidth recording. The hospital admitted procedural failure and made changes. The family was grateful the man was located and alive. The community pushed for better notices and for a public registry of transfers when families did not consent. Officer Ramirez closed the police report as an administrative matter with recommendations for stronger inter-unit communications. The lessons I took with me were practical and hard-earned. Always ask for the name and badge number of the staff when someone says a loved one has been moved. Ask to be given written documentation of any transfer and to be told the name of the receiving unit. If something feels wrong, write down the time and take photos of the monitor and of the bed as you saw it. Use your phone to record conversations with staff and save messages and emails. If you believe documentation is missing, ask to speak to patient relations and to the risk manager. And if necessary, contact law enforcement to file a formal missing persons report. These actions create a paper trail that protects families and sometimes forces institutions to act. In the months after the incident, I changed how I travel and how I sit in waiting rooms. I am more meticulous with recordings and with asking questions. I also keep a small printed list in my wallet of the steps to take when a hospital does not communicate. The strange friction of that night is a reminder that good intentions do not replace procedure and that small administrative gaps have human consequences. For me, the case never became a thriller with a single villain. It became a study in how systems fail when they rely on back-channel fixes, and how vigilance by family and community pressure can produce real change. If you have a similar story, start your comment with your city and the headline in one short sentence. Share any proof you have, and please consider requesting your hospital's transfer protocol in writing. We built a small list of resources to check in a hospital waiting room, and it is linked below. My hope is that by telling this story and by compiling public records and witness accounts, something shifts in how hospitals treat nighttime transfers and how families are notified. The final thought I want to leave you with is simple. Institutions are made of people and processes. When processes loosen, people are the ones who pay the cost. If you care for someone in a hospital, do not accept the easy answer. Ask the question, record the time, keep the receipt. Trust that small details, when treated with attention, become the difference between confusion and accountability.